Good evening. Welcome to Westchester Newsline. I'm Kevin McCabe. In boxing, some of the best fights are always looked more forward to the second time around. The rematches, they call them the grudge matches. The second Dempsey-Tooney fight was the best, and Schmeling-Lewis and Ali Frazier. It seems that after a while these boxers know each other's strengths and weaknesses and how to attack and put someone on the ropes, and it's just always a more interesting fight. We might be in for something like that in the political arena here in Westchester. 2 years ago now, 1986, in 1984, Orrin Teicher ran against Joe DioGuardi for the congressional seat vacated by Richard Ottinger. This year, it might happen again. Our guest tonight on Westchester Newsline is that other boxer, Orrin Teicher. Thanks for coming down.
Kevin, good to be back.
Okay, first of all, tell us, what have you been doing since the last time we saw you?
I've been working as a consultant, mostly in the public affairs and health area, in which I have some particular interest, both here in New York as well as spending some time in Washington.
Okay. You're probably going to be running against Joe DioGuardi again. Well, again, that's a separate issue. We'll get into that. But what do you think would be different this time? Why do you think you can beat him this time when you didn't last time?
Well, I think 1986 obviously is a different year than 1984. Importantly, it's not a presidential election year. The politics of presidential election years do help shape the issues slightly differently. I would hope that in a non-presidential year that the public will pay a little more attention to the differences between the individual candidates for Congress, rather what the national tickets that we're running on. So I think it will be a good year, a good opportunity. Of course, the other thing that makes all the difference is that Mr. DioGuardi has now been the congressman for a year, and he has a record which I think we can talk about and debate during the course of the campaign. And I think as we have the opportunity to do that over the course of the next 9 or 10 months, voters in Westchester are going to find that that's a record that I think there are things in it they're not going to be very pleased with.
Okay. Some people would say that there might be strength in DioGuardi's record. A lot of people are giving him marks for being a good congressman. He has the advantage now over you of being there in Congress and putting in, it'll be 2 years by the time he's up again. Won't that actually give him a little bit more, say, hey, I'm here, I know the ropes, I know what's going on, I've started some things here. Won't that give him more of an advantage over you?
Kevin, there is no question that incumbent members of Congress have an enormous advantage when they seek re-election. I spent some years, as you know, working for a different incumbent congressman and know something about those advantages that an incumbent has in a campaign. And I think those are substantial, and I wouldn't underestimate at all how difficult the campaign would be. But as I said, I think 1986 would be a slightly different kind of year for us, certainly a different mood nationally in terms of some of the issues that we hope.
Certainly the top of the ticket would be more favorable to you with Mario Cuomo running instead of Ronald Reagan.
That certainly will help. The top of the ticket, as you know, in 1984, the Reagan ticket carried the congressional district by over 30,000 votes. I lost by a little over 4,000 votes. We managed to turn a lot of people around, not quite enough. I think this time we may have an opportunity to do that when people will have the chance to pay attention to what it is that Mr. DioGuardi has done in Washington as the congressman, as opposed to the kind of things that I've talked about, what I have done both in public and private life, and the kind of congressman I think I could be.
All right. DioGuardi's been in now for 2 years, and he's been coming back and he's been giving a lot of speeches. He's been letting people know what he's doing. How do you rate him? How do you see him as a congressman? Now you're going to have your chance now to speak on it, and you're going to have less time to do it in than he's had time to build it up. So how do you see the...
Well, I think that he has not been particularly effective. I think if you look at his voting record in Washington, I don't think that he's particularly had much of an impact. He has been there, as you say, for a year, and I'd like to know what it is that he's done for the voters in Westchester County, in this congressional district, that he can point to. I think his votes in the closing days of the congressional session, for example, in opposing the bipartisan tax bill that had been supported by President Reagan, that importantly maintain the deductibility of state and local income taxes, which Mr. DioGuardi opposed. I must say I find that terribly troubling for a representative for Westchester County.
Would you have voted in favor of that bill?
Absolutely, absolutely. That bill wasn't perfect. There were problems in the Ways and Means Compromise tax bill as it emerged from the House, but I think it was terribly important to keep the process going to the Senate, to get some form of tax legislation, tax reform out of Congress this year. we have an opportunity, and I think the President deserves credit for having allowed and created an opportunity to get tax reform on the table, and to do what Mr. DioGuardi and other Republicans did and try to just kill it in its tracks seemed to me to have been a terrible mistake, particularly when that legislation, as passed by the House, did do the things that those of us here in New York were most concerned about, and that is maintaining the deductibility of state and local taxes. So I think that there are going to be issues which we're going to be able to point to in the incumbents' record. I think the incumbents leading the charge up the hill on the so-called Graham-Rudman balanced budget.
That was going to be my next question. What about
I can anticipate your questions.
For our viewers, that's the bill that has to balance, the federal government has to balance the budget by 1992, I believe it is. And if Congress doesn't, the President can.
I think Graham-Rudman is phony. If Congress is in the position to make, Congress should be in the position to make the tough decisions that we elect members of Congress to make. We send people to Washington to vote on those things and not abdicate that responsibility and give it to the President. Now, as you know, there's some substantial question as to whether the whole thing is constitutional. The courts will decide that, and I trust they'll decide that fairly quickly. But even putting the whole question of the constitutionality aside, it seems to me that members of Congress ought not to abdicate what is the responsibility they were elected to do. And if you're going to vote against veterans' benefits, or if you're going to vote against student loans, you're going to vote against Social Security to cut those programs, you should be able to come to your constituents and say so, and not say we're going to do it with these arbitrary numbers put in by some mechanism and ultimately have the power that Congress is supposed to have giving it to the administration. And I think that legislation was a terrible mistake, it was a bad idea, and I hope as time goes on it will be undone. I certainly would have opposed it.
What do you think? We mentioned President Reagan here, we've been talking about him. What do you think about him now? He's not a lame duck yet. I think Tip O'Neill might have been a little early when he called him a lame duck a few months ago. What do you think of his second term and the effect he's had on the country?
Well, I think the President, certainly on some questions like tax reform, for example, has demonstrated a degree of leadership and a willingness to compromise and a willingness to understand that if you can't get the whole pie, sometimes getting half of the pie is all right. And I think that the President in the second term has demonstrated that. I'm certainly hopeful that the summit and the initiatives that have been taken in terms of dealing with the Soviets, I think, are certainly a step in the right direction. So I'm optimistic about the Reagan administration. I have lots and lots of areas in which I disagree with specific policy initiatives that there, certainly in the Graham-Rudman thing, as we discussed, and the way in which they're going about dealing with now $220 billion deficits. Last time when we talked, it was $200 billion.
That's right.
Somehow we found another $20 billion in a year or so. But I think that the President in the foreign policy area certainly has shown some initiatives, and we ought to support him on those.
Okay, let's talk about foreign affairs for a minute. Excuse me, but when I have congressional candidates on, that's the chance I can get into foreign affairs, not with the more local politicians. What do you think of Gorbachev's proposal, freezing out, getting rid of nuclear weapons by the year 2000? Is that possible?
I question a little bit of the practicality of an approach that's going to say that we're ever going to really eliminate nuclear weapons, but I applaud it. I think it represents a terribly important initiative on behalf of Mr. Gorbachev and the Soviets. It certainly demonstrates a recognition on their part that the time has come to seriously negotiate with us about this absolutely out of control nuclear arms race. So I think it's positive and I think it's constructive, and I was pleased that the President, in response, didn't dismiss it out of hand, did indicate a willingness to discuss and talk to the Soviets. I think that's a step in the right direction.
Okay. What do you think about Mr. DioGuardi's record on defense and foreign affairs?
Well, I think that his record is found wanting in many areas. I certainly would have opposed strongly the further U.S. aid to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, which Mr. DioGuardi has supported. I think that's a terrible mistake. We ought not to continue our involvement there, and under the guise of national security and what have you, it seems to me we're only embarking on something that's not going to lead to where I think people would like it to lead. So I certainly would have disagreed there. I certainly would have opposed the President's Star Wars initiative, which Mr. DioGuardi has and continued to support, seems to me, in an era in which we're talking now about $220 billion deficits. The notion that we can go off on some kind of awfully half-baked notion just doesn't seem to me to make sense. I would have been far, far stronger in terms of the opposition that I would have cast in terms of continued U.S. military involvement around the world. I think that we need to recognize that the United States' role in the world has changed, and I think that the Congress is somewhat behind even the President in that area.
Okay. One area where you've always had acknowledged support is in the Jewish community. Congressman DioGuardi has been to Israel now since he's been a congressman, and he's really strengthened his support there. How is that going to affect you?
I don't know if it matters if I should go to Italy or I should go to Ireland, if that's what goes on in politics. I'll tell you, Kevin, I think the people in Westchester County are very smart. We're dealing with a sophisticated, intelligent electorate, and the fact that a public official takes a trip to a different part of the world in an effort to try to suggest an identification with that part of the world, I think people understand that for what it's worth. I don't have any difficulty. The congressman has voted for the foreign aid bill, as I would have. I don't think there's as much question during our 1984 campaign of the difference between where he and I would have stood on issues related to foreign aid and Arab arms sales. But I think that the question really becomes on that issue is what kind of congressman Westchester will have, what kind of leadership a member of Congress can exert in those areas, and my interest and background in that, I think, would provide me a far better opportunity to exert that kind of leadership.
Do you still have contacts in Washington? Do you still, you know, I guess my question is, what value would it be for Westchester to send in the third congressman in 3 years? Why should I vote for you rather than Mr. DioGuardi, who's been there?
I think they should vote for me because I think I could be a better congressman. I think I can be a more effective congressman. I think Mr. DioGuardi has demonstrated that it took him an awful long time to get his office organized, to get his operation going. Having spent the number of years that I have there, I think I understand how to do that. I could do that effectively. And I think the experience I have had now these past 4 years outside of government, working with voluntary health organizations, dealing both in the profit and the nonprofit world with organizations dealing with public policy issues, puts me in a position to be an effective congressman.
I see. Joe DioGuardi is well, we'll give you a break from Joe DioGuardi, okay, for a minute.
I always like talking about Mr. DioGuardi.
I know you do. Why do you think that the reason was that you lost last time? Now, we talked about the top of the ticket. But there was Democrats who did win. Susie Oppenheimer ran in the Senate district, which includes a lot of the, I think most of the congressional district.
Indeed.
She won. Ron Teicher ran for the Assembly, and he was elected in a tight race.
You know, Democrats did win. I think if you take a look, though, at the respective districts in which we ran in, within the area that was encompassed in both Susie and Ron's district, I too won. Fortunately, the congressional district for Democrats includes some other communities that did vote in 1984 heavily for the president, and I think that caused a problem for us. The other thing that happened in 1984, of course, was that we had this long, drawn-out process that selected our Democratic candidate that began about this time in 1984 and lasted until September. We had a convention that was bitterly contested, and that led to a primary that was also bitterly contested. I spent the bulk of 1984 debating and arguing with my fellow Democrats, not spending that time debating
and history has a way of repeating itself, doesn't it?
Well, I hope not. I think the Westchester County Democratic Party in 1986 is looking at this very, very differently than we did 2 years ago. 2 years ago, the party was very divided between some good candidates. Peter Teicher and Ed Meyer both had enormous credibility as candidates for Congress in the beginning of that race in 1984, had substantial support within the Democratic Party and in the community at large. And sometimes when you have a divided party, you have to go through a primary route to select your candidate. That's what happened. We don't have that division this time. I was very proud to have won the overwhelming designation of my party at its meeting last week. And important to me, Kevin, was that I won that not just by winning the support of people who had supported me initially in 1984, but many who had supported other candidates in 1984 in the beginning during the primary campaign. So we've gone a long way in uniting the Democratic Party. And Democrats in Westchester want to win this election. They're not satisfied with the representation that Mr. DioGuardi is providing in Washington. They'd like a different kind of congressman. And though we fight a little bit amongst ourselves occasionally, I think we're going to recognize that the objective here is to elect a Democratic congressman, and I'm confident we'll unite as time goes on.
Okay, I don't think all the Democrats, though, at this point would agree with you that they're all going to be supporting you.
Well,
I'm thinking of a few in particular. I tell you what, we've got to take a short break right here, Warren, and we'll be back, okay, and talk about that. That's called a lead-in, so we get people back after the commercial. Stay with us on Westchester Newsline. We'll be back talking to Orrin Teicher after this.
Hello, I'm Lisa Drescher.
And I'm Peter Meyer. We're volunteers for the American Heart Association. Heart disease is still our #1 killer.
But the American Heart Association has made important progress in our community by reducing deaths and heart-related problems through research.
Research takes money, and we raise money during our annual Heart Radiothon.
Tune in to Westchester's radio stations Friday, January 31st and Saturday, February 1st, so you can be part of this life-saving program. The American Heart Association. We're fighting for your life.
There's really only one sure way to keep up to date on college basketball in our area, and that's done by watching the Iona College Basketball Show every Thursday night at 7:30. Join Gales head coach Pat Kennedy and me, John Carridio, as we review and preview all of the Gales action on the court. We'll have game highlights, keep track of the other major college powers, and take your phone calls so you can be part of the action. That's live every Thursday night at 7:30. The Iona College Basketball Show, it's the only way to stay in touch.
Good evening and welcome back to Westchester Newsline. Our guest tonight is Orrin Teicher, who has been selected by the Executive Committee of the Westchester Democratic Party to run against Joe DioGuardi for Congress. And I said selected by the Executive Committee. Just before we went to the commercial, we were talking about it. Bella Abzug, who is a national known figure, has made some rumblings, shall we say, in Westchester County that she might be interested in running as the Democrat to oppose Joe DioGuardi. Now, you said last time you ran that you did spend a lot of time and a lot of money battling other Democrats in a primary first, and then you only had a couple months left to go after DioGuardi.
7 weeks.
7 weeks, okay. What's going to happen this time? Mrs. Abzug said she might force a primary.
Kevin, I think at this time, you got to remember we're in January. The political year is young. A lot's going to happen as time goes on. The Democratic Party did choose to begin this process early to designate a candidate, as they did just this past week. And we in the Democratic Party are fortunate that we have an enormous amount of talent and able people, men and women who want to run for public office. I think that makes us a stronger party, not a weaker one. But I think Democrats in Westchester, as they look at this race, are going to make the judgment, because the history of the 1984 campaign is still very, very fresh in most of our minds, and they're going to recognize that, unfortunately, because we have so few people who participate in party primaries, that it doesn't make very much sense to end up spending the bulk of the political season competing amongst ourselves and not competing against what really matters, and that is in competing against the Republican. And I think as time goes on, people will recognize that. I think the other candidates have to have an opportunity to go out and test the waters and test the support. I think they're going to find that the Democrats in Westchester are united. The Democrats in Westchester don't want to repeat the 1984 experience. They want to unite. The new county chairman has made very, very clear that winning the 20th congressional seat back is a priority for him and for the party. And Mr. Weingarten is committed to making sure that we win this election. And I think with that kind of top leadership committed to that, I think will make a difference. And it's a very different situation. In 1984, for example, during the primary, as I think I mentioned earlier, the party was divided. The other candidates did have substantial support within the party. Well, that's not the case now. So I think they'll see it as time goes on, and I'm confident we'll unite.
Okay. Last time we mentioned that Ronald Reagan was at the top of the ticket, and that does bring in more of a national focus to a race, a congressional race. This time around, we're going to have Mario Cuomo at the top of the ticket for the Democrats. And will issues be more local, do you think, this time? And also, we've talked about foreign affairs. What do you feel are the most important local issues for Westchester County for their
Kevin,
congressman?
I think that Certainly, when you run for Congress and you're discussing issues that relate to the Congress, basically you're talking about the whole range of foreign policy, defense, domestic issues as well. So I don't think the campaign will be focused any particularly less on foreign policy issues as it may have been before. I think the difference, though, is that the public will pay more attention to the individual candidates who are running for Congress and their views on those issues, and not whether or not they agree with their candidate for president or disagree with the candidate for president. I think that's the difference. I think that there are substantial issues of importance to Westchester County that Congress will be dealing with, and that I think will be things that we'll talk about. Well, certainly the tax reform bill, because of the question of the deductibility of state and local taxes, becomes a terribly important issue. The county executive, when he announced, I guess back in November or so, the reason why it was he needed, I think it was an 11% increase in our county taxes, was because of what was going on in Washington. So I think that the interrelationship between what happens in local government and what happens in Washington will become clear, and those are subjects I think that we will be debating during the campaign. The other thing that I think becomes very central in the course of a congressional campaign: a member of Congress is one of those unique officials in public life that has the opportunity to become an advocate for people. And whether it be as individuals, as organizations, be it the communities which that congressman represents, it seems to me that there's a real special opportunity to have an impact, and a positive one, on your community. I think the record will show this past year that the incumbent congressman has not perceived the job in that way. He hasn't been that kind of leader in terms of issues that matter locally. He's opened one office, for example, in a high-rise building in downtown White Plains. There's been a long Westchester tradition by both Democratic and Republican congressmen of multiple constituent service offices, of going to where people are and really reaching out to try to bring the federal government closer to people. And I think that the incumbent hasn't demonstrated an understanding that that's in large part of what a U.S. congressman can do. So there'll be lots to talk about that affects things right here in Westchester, and what an individual member of the House can do for one's own constituents.
You said more of an advocate for the people. What do you mean by that?
Well, I've viewed that a congressman's role is to be an advocate in the sense of going to Washington and going to bat for your communities, whether it be with the different federal departments, whether it be working in terms of making certain that certain regulations work to the advantage of our communities, whether it be an individual who's lost a Social Security check, who's has trouble with the Veterans Administration. But you can't just sit back in your office and expect people to come to you with those problems.
Right.
You need to go out and reach them.
You're saying you would be more service-oriented than Mr. DioGuardi has been?
I think that I would. And I think the demonstration of what kind of service-oriented congressman I would be, and I would point to the pattern that had been established in Westchester, as I say, by both other Democratic and Republican congressmen, of having several offices, having mobile offices, for example, reaching out to people. You got to go drum up the constituents and go be sure that you're reaching them. A lot of people don't know that a congressman's office is in a position to do those things. You got to go out and seek them.
Would you take money from political action committees in your campaign?
I would. Unfortunately, money in politics, Kevin, is the worst part of running for public office, and the absolutely outrageous amounts that take to run campaigns effectively. In my last campaign, I spent $440,000. Doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about that. But if you're going to be credible, if you can be able to raise the funds you need to get your message across, particularly when I'm now facing an incumbent, it seems to me that you've got to go to those sources where money is being contributed to campaigns. And
who are those sources? I mean, everybody hears about political action committees, and I think that there might even be a stereotype against some of them now. But I mean, where does that money come from? Who are those people?
Political action committees are supported by you and I. They're supported by individuals who happen to agree or support an organization, whether it be an organization interested in promoting nuclear freeze, whether it's interested in promoting pro-choice questions, whether it's interested in promoting positions of a labor union or of a business or whatever. There's a whole gamut of issues. And there's nothing sinister about PACs. What has become sinister, in my view, isn't political action committees in themselves, is that when you get political action committees that totally dominate the funding of individual candidates, and that's where all of their money comes from, they get no support from the public. I think what we need is reform in the percentage of funds that a candidate raises from PACs, but PACs represent another way of people to be involved in the political process. I don't have any problem with that. What I do have a problem with is when candidates receive all of their money from PACs, because I think that distorts the process somewhat.
Okay. What do you see are the most important issues facing Westchester in this congressional
Well, I think
election
clearly
year?
the most important issue is the quality of representation that we are receiving, and whether or not the voters in the congressional district are satisfied with that. I think I'll be able to point out during the course of the next 10 or 11 months that I could do a better job. I can work more effectively with local governments. I can work more effectively in Washington, work more effectively in the House of Representatives to be a stronger, more effective advocate for Westchester County. I think that will be the central question that I'll be discussing. There'll then be dozens of specific issues that will come up in which Mr. DioGuardi and I, I'm sure, will disagree, and whether those are questions about aid to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, whether it be on tax reform, whether it be in support of the Graham-Rudman balanced budget proposal. I think we will find lots of areas to disagree. Mr. DioGuardi and I, when we did campaign in 1984, did disagree on most things. And that's why I'm anxious to debate and to deal and campaign against him, not campaign against my fellow Democrats, where most of us agree.
Okay. What do you see is the mood of the country being in the next immediate future? Joe DioGuardi is always bringing out that he's a certified public accountant. He's grabbed hold of the economy issue, which is a hot issue and very important with the budget deficits and everything. He seems to have locked onto that. Do you have any theme, or do you see anything important that...
Kevin, I know he has latched on to that, but I think the legitimate question that the voters in Westchester can ask, well, what's he done for us? What has he done in Washington in the year that he's been there to deal with now $220 billion deficits? How can he explain supporting Graham-Rudman when in fact what he has done as a congressman is not go to Washington, make the tough decisions about cutting government spending, but has abdicated that responsibility? I think that when we look at questions like tax reform that he talked about a great deal during our 1984 campaign, the President of the United States and the Ways and Means Committee came up with a tax bill. And as I said at the beginning of the program, it wasn't perfect, but it was better than what we have now. And it seems to me that that's the kind of initiative that we ought to be supporting.
You say you don't think Graham-Rudman will hold up through the courts?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, certainly not a constitutional expert. I've read a series of pieces about it. There's some disagreement as to what the constitutionality of it will be. We'll find that out shortly as the courts rule. I certainly hope that we might solve the problem somewhat more easily if the courts throw it out. If they don't, Congress is going to be faced with a terrible task of having ultimately to undo it, because I think we're going to find very, very shortly the public isn't going to support it.
Okay. There's going to have to be cuts somewhere.
Absolutely.
Okay. If Graham-Rudman does go through and becomes the law, Congress will have to make those cuts somewhere, or the president will.
Well, it is the law. It has been passed by Congress.
Where would you like to, where should we cut? I mean, if you were a congressman, you had a vote on it, or if you go into
Kevin,
Congress, like you said, said, okay, here's where we have to cut out the fat, where would it be?
I think we desperately need to do that. And Democrats make a terrible mistake, in my view, of tying ourselves to every program of the past, and we get caught with all of this baggage to say that the government ought to be involved in everything, and government, we can't cut this program, we can't cut that program, we can't touch this. I do think that we as Democrats, if we're going to look to the future, recognizing these deficits are such, that we are going to have to make cuts. And it's not just going to be able to be in the defense area, it's just not going to be able to be in the area in support to the Contra rebels and other things of that kind. We're going to have to look at domestic programs. There are domestic programs that don't make sense, and we are going to have to cut those back. And I think if Democrats are going to believe that we're going to need to say that, and we're not going to be able to lock ourselves into saying, well, you can't touch this, can't touch that, can't cut that program. And I think if you look at what... Are
there any areas, though, that you wouldn't touch at all, Social Security?
I don't believe, frankly, as we look at $220 billion deficits, that we ought to take anything off of the table. I think this discussion during Graham-Rudman, well, we got to take this off the table, we got to take that off the table. I think everything needs to be on the table, because I think if we're serious about cutting deficits, we've got to look at the full range of programs, including Social Security.
Okay. We'll probably be talking. It's a long election year. Okay, thanks for coming down to Westchester Newsline tonight.
Good to be here.
Okay. From all of us here at Cable 3 News, thanks for joining us. I'm Kevin McCabe. Good night.